So up next, we have Iman Oubou, who will be having a fireside chat with Kenza Mhimdat. They're going to have a really nice conversation up here so you can really see into the story behind the success. So without further ado, can we welcome Kenza and Iman.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to have a conversation with a very different topic. So my name is Kenza Mhimdat, and I'm from Casablanca, Morocco. I am studying international relations and environmental science at Wellesley College, and I'm also a student here at MIT, where I take classes and do research at the Global Engineering Research Laboratory. So today, we have this conference about envisioning the future with the focus on the cities of the Middle East and North Africa. And it is essential to consider the role that women have in bringing and shaping innovation to these cities. And this is why the theme of our talk today will be on women empowerment and innovation, because the women's conversation is very important. So cities are in general gendered spaces, and cities in the North African and Middle Eastern region are even more gendered spaces. And by gendered, I mean that the power dynamics often belongs to men and are controlled by men. And most of the time, men's concerns and experiences are privileged over women. So now, if you can have a look at this room and analyze the male to female ratio, so that speaks a lot about what's happening in the region. Women fully belong to the public space, and we should not apologize to claim that we own the space as much as our male counterparts. According to Lili Motari, a senior economist working for the World Bank, focusing on the MENA region, women make up only 21% of the labor force and only contribute 18% to the region's overall GDP. And despite the strong social pressures in the region, women's empowerment has considerably improved during the past decades, and many North African and Middle Eastern women are fighting against the odds to make their voices heard, have a positive impact on society, and get the monetary value they deserve for their work. In other terms, equal pay. Many women are striving in and outside of the region, and it is extremely important to acknowledge and appreciate their work. And this is why today we have the privilege to host Iman Oubou, who's going to share with us her personal experience and tell us how she works towards embracing women empowerment and innovation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor being here today. I actually used to dream to go to MIT, but I just went to Colorado State. But I love this place. It's so great to hear all about the innovation and impact that's really taken place at such an early stage, and young talent really thinking about the future of our nation and the world.
Yeah. So my first question. Wait, I should introduce you first. So
that would be nice.
So Iman is a Moroccan-American self-made entrepreneur, published scientist, and former beauty queen, Miss New York in 2015. And through her diverse experience with business, pageantry, and STEM, Iman noticed gender disparities in the workforce and in the representation of women across different media platforms, and so she decided to launch Sway, which is a digital platform highlighting stories of female leaders challenging the status quo and championing the voices of female change makers. So basically, my first question is, so can you tell us about your experience of being a businesswoman and the CEO of your own female-focused media platform? What drives your motivation, and what are the impacts you have on women's involvement in innovation?
Yeah, so I think I really took a very unconventional path to entrepreneurship. I never really dreamt of myself as a businesswoman or ever thought I was good at business. I actually graduated for biochemistry and molecular biology, and then went on to do my master's in biomedical engineering. So I always really aspired to be a cancer research scientist, which I did for a few years after graduating in Germany and in here in Colorado. And I think during that time of experiencing the real world as a woman, I started seeing a lot of the corporate culture and how it sometimes worked against women rather than giving them a platform and a culture that helped encourage them to be leaders. And then it was interesting because at the same time, I also went into medical missions around the world. So I went in, I was the only woman going on this huge medical missions to South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Morocco recently. And it was, I just kind of experienced the whole being the only woman in the room so many times, multiple times. And it sometimes worked against my promotion. Sometimes it was really interesting to see the power dynamics and the gender imbalance play out. I was also competing in beauty pageants on the side, which I think didn't really help my case because people were like, wait, you're a scientist and Miss New York? How does that work? You know, people have this image that women are not as multidimensional because the media portrays us always in buckets and always loves to paint women into tight corners. So if you're a scientist, you can't necessarily be competing in beauty pageants because that's so unheard of, and vice versa. If you want to be a model, then you're not probably as smart as most other women in the room. So I just started really experiencing that myself, especially being multidimensional and embracing my place as a leader, but also embracing my femininity. And in 2015, when I did win Miss New York, I finally realized that I had a platform to finally be a voice and find my voice and be a change agent in a community. I actually was very much inspired by Rima Faki, who was the first Arab woman to ever win Miss USA. And so that really made me realize that young women are in need of more diverse role models and women to look up to in the media, in the world, and that we needed to challenge the media to start prioritizing women's stories a lot more and giving a platform to women to really share their voices and their opinions and perspectives, especially when it comes to female-forward issues and important, hard-hitting, thought-provoking topics. We can't, as women, only be commenting on fashion and trends and beauty, which has been the case for as long as I remember in the media. Everything that women are reading, all the content that we're consuming is fluffy compared to what's in the news. And 80% of bylines and op-eds are usually given to men from high-end newspapers and top-tier media outlets, even when it comes to women's issues. I'm not sure if you know this stat, but during the 2016 US election, 80% of commentary and expert opinions that have been given in the media about abortion, women's health, and maternal health have come from men. So it got me thinking, why aren't women really involved in these conversations? Why aren't we changing the narrative? If we're really going to change our role in society, we have to be voicing our own stories and telling the world how we feel about, how our role has evolved in society. So that's how really what led me to launch Sway. I started off with a podcast in 2015, really looking for these stories and interviewing awesome female leaders and sharing them in a podcast form. It really took off. It was #2 on iTunes, which really told me that women are hungry for this kind of content and we want this conversation to be had and we want to be at the forefront of these national dialogues. So I dropped everything I was doing from corporate biotech and then just decided to venture out in the startup world, not knowing anything about media really, or how to raise money for a startup or how to hire people, manage all that stuff, which has been a really great experience. And now 3 years in, we have evolved so much, we have grown, and the need for something like this is even more amplified as we continue to see the women's movement really take off.
So can you talk to us about what do you do with Sway?
So now Sway, as it stands, we're launching a new platform at the end of this month. So it's basically combining the best of publishing with the best of social networking to provide women a platform where they can voice their opinions and stories. So think of it as a Medium meets LinkedIn. So we want to connect women through social connections, but also to inspire them through long-form content and really highlight the power of storytelling. Most of the greatest connections I've made with women and building my own inner circle and network have been because I read something about a woman and I really felt inspired by her, or her story resonated with me and I reached out to her. So we really want to encourage more women to really take a stand and share content that inspires you, share your story, share how you feel about certain issues. excuse me, and take part of important conversations. That's really what we want to highlight. And I was so surprised to see that women were ready for it, but there wasn't really a go-to platform to do so. So that's really what we wanted Sway to become, is not just a digital publication, but rather a go-to platform for any woman who feels the need to have a voice and also need that space to share that voice without feeling judged, attacked. I think social media has allowed us a lot to share what we were going through. Twitter has been a big change for women's voices, but we're still, especially in the Middle East, and there's a lot of articles and stats around this, women, when they share their stories or they share how they feel about a certain issue, they're still being attacked. They have death threats, all this stuff that they're going through, and there are popular op-eds that have shown this. So we wanted to curate that conversation and create a safer space that Twitter might not allow.
And so how does your STEM background influence your work with Sway?
Well, I think because I don't come from the media and I come from the STEM world, first of all, that experience has taught me a lot about, problem solving, critical thinking. Just my engineering background helped a lot in figuring out a better way to develop our products that would be different from most media platforms. But it's interesting because when I first went out to get funding, a lot of investors were kind of reluctant to give me any money because they said, well, you don't come from the media world. You have no background in journalism or anything of that sort in terms of content creation. What makes you think that you'd be successful at this? But I would argue it's the opposite. I mean, if we talk about innovation and impact, if we want to innovate, sometimes it's better to innovate from the outside because you're not so caught up in the old school way of doing things. And I just felt like I was that person because, one, I as a woman have lived a lot of those experiences and have felt the need multiple times to have a platform like this, and I didn't find it. So I was my own target demographic. And two, I didn't come from the media world, and I come from a different world that helped me innovate and not be afraid to try new things that most media giants have been so scared to pivot towards. I mean, they're big. You can't expect Condé Nast or Hearst to all of a sudden drop what they've been doing and become this kind of female forward, all about empowerment. They still have to do the clickbait things to make money through advertising. We came in and we're like, we don't want any of that advertising. We don't want the clickbait content. If anything, that's really what we're trying to change. We don't want women to aspire to look like a certain celebrity or be a model or be so-and-so just to be deemed as relevant in society or successful. We really want to change that narrative. And so I think my personal experience and my experience, going to medical missions around the world, seeing the world out there, being from the Middle East to, North Africa, and having lived also as an Arab woman in America, I think has helped me really approach this venture in a different way than most of our competitors.
I read on the Women of Morocco magazine that you're thinking of launching Sway Arabia and or Sway Africa. Can you tell us more about this project?
Yeah, so in the next 2 years, we've been talking to a lot of different bigger media companies out in the Middle East, and especially recently in Dubai, we've talked to ITP Media. We wanted to bring a platform similar to what we're doing here, but to the Middle East, because I think that's really where the bigger emerging market is and the need for it. I think, as much as we like to complain here in the US about women's rights, we're definitely much more advanced than the rest of the world, and we have a lot of ways to express ourselves, but I think the Middle East is really where the need is, so we're definitely now starting to look at the market there and see what already exists in terms of platforms that are focused on elevating female voices, and also finding ways to partner with already existing infrastructures to really launch at a bigger level versus doing the whole startup route in the Middle East as well, because I know that's a whole other world out there.
Yeah, so it is actually inspiring to see how you navigate the space as a woman. And I was wondering if you could share with us any moment where you were challenged or you failed, and how did you do to go over it?
I think my biggest challenge, and I think I'm not the only one, just startup in general, but I think it's even harder for women, is just access to funding and mentorship, which is, again, a part of what we're trying to solve and really give more women access to that through finding the right people and connecting them with them. But for me personally, it was funding that I still struggle with. It's really challenging as a media startup too, to get the funding you need to scale. And I think maybe all familiar with the stats too, is that 2% of VC money last year went to women-led ventures, which is really sad number to shout out loud. And that really also brings back the conversation that we don't necessarily need more female-focused investors or more female investors, but what we do need is a very serious public conversation about the gender dynamics, gender power and respect. And it's a conversation that doesn't only involve women talking to women. Men have to be part of that conversation. They have to really be aware of what struggles are really holding women back, because we've all seen the stats. It's better to have more women at the top of your company because economically proven it's better for the business, not just being the right thing to do. So all of these really, I think men need to take the time to listen to women and really understand where they're coming from, their experiences, and not really get defensive when we actually talk about this, which I think has been a lot of my experiences if I have a debate with someone. And I had one last night at dinner, and a lot of the men get defensive and think that I'm talking to them specifically, but I'm not saying it's all men. I just think it's just a gender imbalance issue, and men have to really be part of the conversation and take responsibility and actually wanting to understand what's going on and how they can help move that conversation forward and change the narrative for women.
So do you think that the gender dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa should follow the example of the West or be constructed separately based on the special characteristics of the region?
I don't think that any region should copy another region. I think we all, especially the Middle East, has strong ties to the culture, the traditions, the religion, and I don't think that just copying what the West is doing is going to be a great way to move forward. I think we have to really characterize and customize that experience to the region. I definitely think that there's been a lot more advancement in that conversation. I recently have been to Morocco. I mean, there's a lot more conferences. There's a lot more media coverage around these issues. So people are starting to talk, which is a great thing because you can't really solve a problem if we're in denial about it. But I definitely think that some regions in the Middle East are starting to take initiative to really embrace female leadership. And we've seen some articles recently come out around how the next biggest wave of leadership is coming out of the Middle East region, and it's all mostly women.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to open up the questions to the public.
Two questions. So being a media venture, if you're not ad-driven, how are you making money? Second of all, sorry.
Second question.
What role do you think the beauty industry plays in either empowering women or keeping them in where they are right now in our society?
So to answer the first question, we are now becoming a membership model. Because we want to curate the conversation, so I think it works well for what we're trying to do. I know a lot of media companies that are trying to be everything for everyone can't necessarily follow the membership model, but we've seen that we have an engaged audience, super fans that really believe in what we do. Because we are mission driven, we can kind of justify that, if you love what we're doing, then you can contribute to it, and it's $7.99 a month, it's not a lot. So that's why we can also be more selective when it comes to ads. We're not doing the traditional advertising, banners, and none of that stuff, but we do partner with really interesting companies that are actually trying to use their platforms, their wealth, to empower women and move that conversation. A good example is Microsoft, around actually Women in STEM initiative and really elevating the voices of female STEM leaders to share their stories and become more role models to the younger generation. So I wouldn't call that advertising, but it's more partnerships, paid partnerships. But again, we can be very selective about those because we don't rely on advertising only. And then the second question, in terms of the beauty industry, obviously now because of this movement and how this culture is kind of reinventing itself, the industry itself is thinking a lot about how they want to position themselves as a brand. I was just talking at Benefit Cosmetics last week in San Francisco, and the whole conversation was about, look, we don't want to just be a beauty brand. We want to actually use our platform to partner with really interesting outlets as well as organizations like Planned Parenthood, or hiring the first woman with Down syndrome to be their ambassador. So now they're really rethinking the conversation, and they know that consumerism has changed. A lot of women especially don't really buy anymore based on what's popular or what YouTube blogger is using. I think it's about what, I vote with my money. So if I'm gonna spend money on a mascara or whatnot, I wanna spend it with the right brand because I know they're walking the walk and not just talking the talk. So I think that's another thing that a lot of brands are rethinking, especially in the beauty industry. They're really incorporating social responsibility. And they know that if they don't really get in part of the conversation, they're gonna lose the loyal customers. So I think they're using it for good now, thank God. But it's still got a long way to go, for sure.
So,
very nice platform. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
At MIT, we like a lot of data, and you gave us 1.2% of the venture capital money is going to women versus 98% for men, I suppose. Do you have any data on the return on investment normalized by the 2 and the 98, just as a comparison?
I know there's definitely data around that. I don't have it off the top of my head, so I'm not just going to shout out random numbers, but there has been data showing that the return on investment of in companies that have female leadership, or like a female co-founder, or that is completely female-led, is much higher than all-men team. And there's absolutely data for that. You could easily find it for sure.
to change.
Hi, my name is Anais. So the question I have is, how do you sort of combat the narrative or the argument that you as a woman in power and as a woman who is being innovative and being a thinker, how do you combat the narrative that you are in turn sort of looking to bring down men in power and sort of, I guess, raise women and bring down men? Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question, because I think that's, the big part of really educating men about this is telling them that the ascent of women is not the downfall of men, and it's more of a, we have to cooperate together to really advance both genders in society. So that's why as a brand, we don't say men are not allowed. We have a lot of great men that are contributors on the platform. We never said men are not part of the conversation. Every time I can take a moment to educate a man about maybe, doing something inappropriate or thinking about approaching, women leadership in a different way, I take that opportunity to educate them rather than fight them. So I feel like it's more about really sharing our voices and letting men in on that conversation. That way they're not feeling that they're, it's an exclusive conversation. It's all inclusive, because we can't really change that narrative, just women talking to women. It involves men as well.
So do we have time for another question? Or?
Last
Yeah, one more. The woman there.
Hello, and nice for your talk. I was really impressed by what you were saying. I'm actually Ijlal. I am Humphrey Fellow at MIT. I am from Sudan, and Sudan is now on the media, of course. So it's more a comment. The role of women, since early times, it was always great. Sometimes it's up and sometimes it's down. As for my country, after Karari, the Battle of Karari, all men and youth were killed because a lot of people were killed. At that time, women had great roles there. And whenever there is economic crisis and whatever crisis, women, they stand up. And now in our latest crisis, the women in the roads, in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in the open spaces were much more than the men, more than 50% of the men, because they suffered from the regime. They were the most sufferers from the regime. So now they are out again. So I think the role of women, it's there. Women are always there. They're always the healers. They're always, they have these talents of curing, of whatever thing. So they are always there. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you
You're
so
right.
much.
That's why we need to give all the credit as much as we can.
Thank you. So, Yeah, so just to conclude, media platforms democratize space, but it is still a very gendered space for women, and it is challenging. Women are claiming the space, women own the space, and thanks to the mission of engaged people like Iman, Oubou, it is time to sway the narrative. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.